In this exciting episode of the Perry Pod, real estate mogul Stuart Brent is getting married after being a widower. Is the second time a charm? Come on now, y'all know the drill. It's Season 1, Episode 33 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Gilded Lily. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy. My purpose here is pretty simple: provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and as time permits, I'll look at some of those made-for-TV movies too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired, and each episode I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler, where just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library! Each episode in the Law Library, we return to prior cases to refresh our memories about Perry's past so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. The case of the Gilded Lily features a rarity in the Perry Mason world: the client consulting.
Now, Mr. Lacey, you say this ad appears in your magazine, Lonely Hearts Calling?
You're thinking the ad is a fraud, aren't you, Mr. Drake?
I'm thinking.
So are the postal authorities. Unless I can satisfy them that the ad is genuine, they say that I'll be charged with using the mails to defraud.
Paul Drake before Perry Mason. Thought it may be worth a trip to the law library to see if there were any other precedents for this. And the case files turn up one prior episode where Paul gets pulled into a case before our intrepid hero. It was the case of the lonely heiress. You might remember this case because Paul was infamously hired not by a future defendant like he is in the case of the Gilded Lily, but by all-around schnooknick and magazine mogul Edmund Lacey of Lonely Hearts fame to figure out how to get the identity of his mag's anonymous heiress. In short, Paul's the kind of detective you want when the stakes are small. It's best to let Perry himself dial Paul up if you need a hotel cased, a woman impersonated, or your per diem for meals needs to get 86'd fast. Paul can certainly do that for you. Now, without further ado, let's get to the plot of this episode. The case of the Gilded Lily. Our defendant is Stuart Brent, the man who owns the Brent building where Perry does his work. He's newly married to a younger wife after having lost his first wife in, mysterious fashion. We're not really told.
Good morning, Mr. Brent, and congratulations.
She sure is pretty. Thanks, George. Perry, good to see you, Brent. And congratulations. Thanks.
Not everyone is as happy as he is.
Enid, Mr. Charles Stuart Brent is your employer, not your boyfriend. You work for the man. You don't own him.
He was so kind and so considerate. And after his first wife died, we got to be so close.
That's right. The episode opens with Mr. Brent's secretary, Enid, nearly committing suicide because she's so distraught over Mr. Brent's nuptials. But she survives, and soon it's Mr. Brent who's in panic mode. The day he returns to work, Mr. Brent is approached by Arthur Binney, who commits some thinly veiled blackmail.
My partner and I are planning a little business venture, and we thought you might like to buy some space.
Just how does this concern my wife?
My partner and I were planning a series of articles on the wives of prominent people. We thought that Mrs. Brent would make an interesting story, particularly with mug shots and fingerprints.
Without $30,000 from Mr. Brent, Mr. Binney swears he'll tell this story to the world. So Mr. Brent enlists Paul Drake to help confirm the charge.
Could that be a forgery?
Could be. There's an easy way to find out. Ask Mrs. Brent.
Look, Mr. Drake, I'm in love with my wife. I'm not looking for a divorce.
Alas, it's true. Mr. Brent goes out to pay the money, only to get hit on the head from behind when he enters the hotel room, resulting in him losing the cash and waking up next to a dead Arthur Binney. Uh-oh!
How well did you know Arthur Binney?
Well enough to kill him.
You realize what you're saying, Mr. Brent?
Exactly. If you care to, I'll dictate a statement.
In court, Perry grills a forensics expert and gets him to reveal that hairs in the hotel room correspond to a peroxide blonde.
Did you subject these hairs to a microscopic analysis?
I did.
What did they tell you about the person who used it?
Well, from the structure and size of the hair, I should say that the woman that used this towel was in her early 30s. She's a habitual user of peroxide ammonia, and the hair endings indicate that she was originally a light brunette.
The case boasts 3 such women: Enid, Sheila Cromwell, who's Enid's roommate and Mr. Brent's sort of Gertie figure, and Mrs. Brent. It seems like one of them was responsible for the crime. And in fact, we get an honest-to-goodness fake-out. The court sequence of this episode ends with the hotel operator identifying Sheila Cromwell as Binney's partner. But instead of confessing, she denies.
Present in this court?
She sure is. She's sitting right over there.
That's a lie. I didn't kill Binney. Well, why should I? We were partners. He was alive when I left the motel that night. I didn't do it. I swear it. I swear I didn't do it.
Was she the actual murderer? Well, in the denouement we discover, it was the hotel operator.
All right, Mason, so you were right. But what was the tip-off?
Well, my client was telling the truth. It meant that someone else entered Unit 8 while Brent was unconscious. Now, who was in the best position to manage that?
Mitchell. He had a passkey.
Hmm?
Button, who's got the button? That sounds like a fun game, especially for a gambler like our hotel operator. The episode features some fun little tidbits, like this bit of wisdom from Paul.
Mr. Brent, may I give you some advice?
Like what?
Blackmail, like cancer, needs radical treatment. If I were you, I'd see a lawyer.
I'll keep it in mind.
If Mr. Drake keeps that up, we'll have to start a Paul proverb. That was pretty wise. There's also this throwaway bit from the eventual murderer who shows us that he'd probably commit a crime since he's slightly annoying. I'm not really sure.
There's a horse running here in Santa Anita called Walsh's Pride. I'm going to put $2 on his nose. No sense of humor.
His joke didn't kill, so he has to kill. I'm not sure what the writers were going for there. It's a fun little flourish. And finally, we get the ultra-rare statement to the jury from Hamilton Berger.
We will show you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, a statement which the defendant voluntarily made and signed, in which he confesses to the murder of Arthur Binney.
This is just a side note, but I don't think I've seen a single case, either in the books or in the show, where Perry has offered an opening or closing statement. Never. There are some major and minor differences between the 1956 novel, The Case of the Gilded Lily, and its television adaptation. Let us count the ways. First, Stuart Brent manages to find himself saddled with the murder charge before consulting Perry. And he doesn't see a lawyer about his blackmail. He certainly doesn't ring up Paul Drake to check his wife's fingerprints. Number 2, in fact, checking up on his wife's fingerprints is a second difference, because Enid, his secretary, A, never attempts suicide, B, had a romantic relationship with Brent after the first Mrs. Brent died and before the second Mrs. Brent appeared on the scene. And C is a junior detective who took a correspondence course in everything, so she's the one who compares fingerprints to show that Mrs. Brent was indeed the person who was arrested for insurance fraud. Number 3, there's a much more complicated scheme going on with Benny, who fakes like he has a male partner, has a female accomplice who's not connected with Brent at all, unlike Sheila Cromwell, and the hotel operator who ends up physically assaulting the female accomplice to keep her quiet, like actually punches her in the face and all that. And the hotel operator actually is the real murderer, so at least that's the same. It's interesting that in this novel, Gardner imitates the pattern of the show by opening on the defendant without Perry. But then the television writers still didn't like that setup, and so they brought Paul and Perry in way earlier than the novel did. It's like Gardner still can't get it right. The television adapters are going to do something major to the novel structure. Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. A Della is something about a particular character or actor or actress in the story. And a Perry is something we learn about our main character. Our Paul this episode concerns fingerprints, which we learn about from our resident private investigator, Paul Drake.
As you can see by these photos, I've listed 15 points of similarity. In court, you only need 12.
So here's this episode's research prompt. What is the current standard for fingerprint points of similarity? 12, 15, 25, 50, 75? Has the standard changed after the advent of DNA testing? Ardella, this episode concerns Mary Alden, better known as the new Mrs. Brent.
Oh, poor my other guests. I'd much sooner get to know you.
Mary Alden was born in Lithuania and moved with her parents to Canada at the age of 3, and that's where she caught the acting bug. By the time she was 21, she was starring in Hollywood movies, and in 1951, she starred alongside Gary Cooper in the Raoul Walsh-directed western Distant Drums. Like her character in the case of the Gilded Lily, Alden was married to an older man who'd been married before, writer-director Tay Garnett, with whom she had a daughter and who she remained married to for over 2 decades until Garnett's death. Garnett, probably best known for directing the 1946 classic film noir, The Postman Always Rings Twice. Mary Alden's last acting credit was in 1968. She never appeared on Perry Mason again, and she died in 2004 at the age of 78. Our Perry this episode concerns Perry's facial expression. At the reception celebrating the Brents' recent nuptials, Perry sips on his sweet martini. That's just the way the late Mrs. Brent liked them. There's a certain look on his face that prompts Della to ask.
Bored?
No, just hungry.
I love this little insight about Perry. 1, we know that Perry and his pals love food. Della and Paul have talked about it a few times. 2, I don't really associate hunger with boredom. I tend to think of getting hangry, which is a combination of hunger and anger. And then what would this be? Whoredom? That doesn't quite sound right, does it? A mixture of hunger and boredom. It's best just to know that if Perry looks like he's tuned out, it's probably because he needs to boost his blood sugar by popping in a sandwich to accompany that sweet martini he's sipping on. Our theme for this episode is the Gilded Lily. What exactly is gilding the lily? Well, it suggests trying to improve something that's already beautiful as it is. This is much clearer in the novel, where the thing that trips up the murderer, the hotel operator, is when he tries to implicate the defendant in a way that's unnecessary and sort of gets Perry thinking about who else might have committed the crime. He already had Brent successfully framed, and instead of stopping there, he tried to give additional evidence, and that additional evidence is what did him in. In the television episode, this Gilding the Lily feature comes up in a couple ways. One, when you try to date your wonderful boss. That is, shouldn't Enid just be happy that Mr. Brent is a terrific boss? Why does she have to get romantically involved with him? Look to Della, Enid. Look to Della. Number two, how about trying to throw Perry off the scent of your being an accomplice to Arthur Binney by suggesting that it was Enid who was out to get Brent? This is what Sheila Cromwell does when she offers an anonymous phone call that starts Perry investigating Enid's attempted suicide, and eventually it just leads back to Sheila having to admit that she was part of the blackmail scheme. I don't know why she did it. She would have been cool if she just left well enough alone. And number three, talk about gilding the lily, trying to capitalize on a steady job running a hotel where you can basically spend your downtime investigating which horses you can bet on by trying to get away with illegally gotten gains from blackmail. The hotel operator totally gilding the lily. Now it's time for a Perry proverb. This episode's moment of wisdom shows Perry unwilling to let Stu Brent speak ill of the dead. When Stu finds out that Arthur Binney was blackmailing his wife too, not just him, he's livid. And Perry tells him his anger is misplaced.
That dirty swine. He deserved killing.
No one deserves killing, Brent. Let's stop that right now.
This is a real difference between the television Mason and the novel Mason. This kind of general humanity exhibited by Mason, and advocacy not just for his clients, but for justice and the dignity of human life more generally, totally a hallmark of Raymond Burr's interpretation of the character. Yeah, even Binney deserves to live. No one deserves to be murdered. And by the end of the episode, Stuart's in the arms of his wife, cultivating love, not revenge. Even on the man who left him hung with a murder rap, the hotel operator. He lets the cops take the hotel operator away while he celebrates with his wife. It looks like Stuart took Perry's proverb to heart. Now, let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
There is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
Our Paul research prompt from the last episode concerned Las Vegas real estate, namely how much did Las Vegas casino building real estate cost circa 1958, and what does casino real estate cost today? The famed Tropicana opened in 1957. That was the closest analog I could find. It was built for $15 million, 50,000 feet of casino space. If you run that math, you have a cost of about $300 per foot. That's about $2,500 in today's cash, and a far cry from the $1,500 that Perry tries to get out of George Castle. There's a pretty big difference between $300 per foot and $1,500. Now, let's compare that to one of the most recent mega casinos to get built in Las Vegas, the Cosmopolitan, which went up in 2010. It boasts 250,000 square feet of casinos and meeting space and went up at a cost of $3.9 billion. That's $15,500 a square foot. Now, that may seem like a lot, but when you look at Perry's offer to George Castle, $1,500, right? That's about $13,500 in today's cash, which is pretty close. But that's just to say that Perry was charging George Castle 2010 prices for 1958 real estate. No wonder George was so hot and bothered. As always, I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about the episode you'd like to comment on or something you'd like to correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com or email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show notes. All Perry Pod episodes are available via Spotify and YouTube as well as iTunes. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Next time we encounter a case of amnesia, a disgruntled stepdaughter, and a failed marriage. Wait, is this the case of the desperate daughter again? Nope. It's the case of the lazy lover. Join me, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat!